Welcome. We're talking today about mergers and acquisitions, M&A in the electric industry. We've got about half an hour to discuss this, and I've got two special guests to help talk about this topic, Tom Cruise and Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Peter Kelly-Detwiler is a 30-year veteran in the electric energy sector. Much of his career has been in areas of the competitive power markets. He releases a weekly utility news update video, and I highly recommend watching this. It's very informative. And has an upcoming book release scheduled in June 2021, entitled The Energy Switch: How Companies and Customers Are Transforming the Electrical Grid and the Future of Power. It covers more details on some of the topics we'll talk about today, and you can pre-order on Amazon. Tom Cruise has been at the epicenter of energy technology industry for over 25 years, both as the CEO of energy tech companies and also raising growth capital for emerging energy tech companies. He's been involved in M&A for some of the largest players in the industry, both in energy and energy tech companies. Myself, I'm Ellen Christopherson, the founder and CEO of clearGRID, a leading utility aerial data collection service provider. We collect for gas, water, and electric utilities, as well as gas pipeline operators. Check out cleargrid.io for more information. Now, before we dive into things today, I want to frame our definition of the electric industry a little bit more. For today's purposes, we'll define the electric industry as including all the players who participate in electricity generation, transportation, delivery, and consumption supply chain. With a few exceptions, everyone in this is either generating revenue through generation and delivery of electricity to consumers, both commercially and non-commercially, or trying to reduce electrical consumption costs. Over the last 5 years, the electric industry has seen a growth in M&A activity. This has been very strong, and in the last year, we've seen a flurry of activity, and everything is suggesting this will continue into the future. That being said, PKD, can you give us a little bit more information? What's behind these recent acquisitions? Can you give us an understanding of some of the macro level trends that might be causing this?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, the 3 Ds that people refer to a lot of times, the decarbonization, the decentralization, digitalization, let's jump into those really quickly. Climate change is climate change, right? The atmospheric chemistry is implacable, unyielding, doesn't care what our ideology is or party affiliation. And everybody's waking up to what that means. We're going to be looking at a transition of energy markets and electric markets that will easily be in the tens of trillions of dollars, far larger than anything humanity has attempted before. As an investment tailwind, you don't often get clearer signals than that to know where to put your money. And then you've got decentralization, right? Where for the first time ever, customers now are prosumers, if you want to use that word, where their assets can now interact with the grid. And the estimates are in the US, somewhere between 65 gigawatts and over 300 gigawatts of customer-centered assets will be interacting with the grid in the near future, probably because of FERC Order 2222, which opens up a pathway for distributed assets to participate in wholesale markets. And then digitalization, which enables that to happen. Sensors are getting dirt cheap. Connectivity with 4G, now 5G, enables the interaction of all these devices and the analytics around a lot of that with intelligence to start to figure out what are the trends. And at the end of the day, power is simply a function of how much you deliver, when you deliver it, for how long, and where you deliver it, all of which needs to be measured. And then you throw in the technologies on top, you get a fantastic witch's brew.
Yeah, Peter, couldn't agree more with you. I think there's a number of other factors that are kind of coming into play here. When I first started in this industry 20 years ago, the most important message was you can't inventory electricity. So supply and demand need to be balanced, or you'd have brownouts, blackouts. That's not the case today. Storage technologies have developed where we now have new ways of producing, storing, transporting, and consuming electricity. That's a big, big change that's driving a lot of different, a lot of rethinking of business strategies. Fossil fuels are no longer the low-cost fuel source. So now you've got wind, solar, and other renewables that are competitive with natural gas and certainly coal. that makes a big difference in terms of the need for government subsidies and where people want to go from a purely economic standpoint. Customers now have multiple choices. The markets are opening up, there's customer choice, there's aggregation, and consumers are becoming increasingly well informed about options that they have. And to your point, they can be both providers of electricity and consumers, and building a asset base, if you will, that allows for both of those to happen. This is happening today and will only accelerate going forward. And then I think the other is that making electricity from renewable sources available to all is a big deal. So we're seeing quite a bit of work in the community solar space, and like where a single solar farm can be made available to people living into apartments. You no longer have to own the rooftop in order to be a good citizen in the use of consumables. I think, in summary, one of the things that we see, I mean, it's pretty straightforward to us in the M&A space, but if you think about it from a thesis perspective, you've got changes in the regulatory construct that are plus the development of new technologies that are creating new opportunities for both residential and C&I customers to both consume and use electricity, which in turn is having a profound effect on the traditional methods that we have used for making money in the electricity industry, and is inviting a lot of new entrants into the space. So we're seeing a lot of folks who historically have not been major players in electricity now entering the market as we move to the electrification of everything.
And there's one other dynamic I'd like to highlight too, which you raised my thinking on. That is, so you've got this thing here, this innovation dynamic where existing technologies, conventional gen, is pretty much flatlined. Gas turbines improve about maybe 1% every decade, according to GE. Solar panels are getting 0.5% better every single year. Battery costs, the levelized cost of energy, according to Bloomberg, have fallen by 50% in the last 2 years. So you have this horse race with the established tech, which is essentially hobbled, and all these new technologies where billions of dollars of R&D money are flowing into the space, making the tech better, which drives further deployment, which then increases more R&D funding and investment in actual manufacturing, which drives the cost down, which drives more adoption. And then you just get this virtual cycle, which accelerates the entire dynamic.
Yeah, I think adding, regulatory are now really pushing hard on the incumbents to come up with non-wire alternatives to allow for the integration of DERs and to build resiliency into the network. And where they might have historically been a point of resistance, they're now kind of a tailwind, if you will, in forcing the incumbents to have to rethink their strategies, and particularly in the utility sector, where you can no longer just view yourself as a seller of kilowatt hours.
So can we jump into some of the micro level examples here? Give us some examples of who's making the acquisitions and why, and maybe if we can tie that back into some of this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So some of the ones that are really interesting are the hydrocarbon or former hydrocarbon companies, whether it's Total, which oil and gas and gas station company now is buying charging companies and building out its network across Europe, and also bought a big share of SunPower, was solar manufacturing and deployment company. Now it's the deployment company because they sold off their manufacturing part of things. Shell buying Sonnen, for example, which is a company that puts solar and batteries on rooftops and creates, with blockchain in some cases, virtual and peer-to-peer type networks. So you're seeing a lot of the hydrocarbon companies, easy for me to say, make investments. And then some of the traditional utility companies as well, jumping into often these customer-focused technologies that are emerging, whether it's solar, whether it's batteries, whether it's microgrids, where they recognize ownership of the customer is going to be paramount in order to future-proof against future changes, technological and sociological and even economic across the spectrum.
We worked in my former role at Bowen Advisors, we helped sell sentient energy to Koch Enterprises. And Koch has historically been an oil and gas player, and they have a 20-year vision on being a major player in the digital grid. And they saw Sentient as a cornerstone acquisition to build out a complete business case that they think will be revenues in the multi-billion dollars in the next 10 years. You see people like Generac acquiring Enbala, okay, because Generac has got hardware, it's got generators and the like, but they really need to be in the solutions business. And that's on top of an earlier acquisition of Nurio. So, different folks are attacking this in a different way. If you've got people like Indra, which is a big player in the EU, acquiring ACS Power as a way to enter the US market and to be a major player in the ADMS space, which is going to be a cornerstone of grid digitization. So there's a number of different places out there where there's activity. And what's interesting is it's a lot of the non-incumbents that are stepping in and aggressively pursuing opportunities, because I think, again, they have bought into the 3Ds and believe this whole electrification of everything mindset that is now taking hold.
I think one last piece of that is customers are getting frustrated with having to buy this from one entity, that from another entity, and that from a third. So you see things like Generac with Enbala also moving into the solar and storage space. You see solar companies now integrating into batteries to offer a larger integrated solution. That's part of the whole merger and acquisition space. Sometimes it's not actually a purchase, it's a development of a adjacent capability that helps them offer something broader to customers, so they don't have to go to that Chinese menu and pull all these disparate items off of there.
Interesting stuff. We've got a comment here from the audience I'd like to just insert here and just see what you guys have to say about it. We've got a comment about investor-owned utilities and their interest in conventional infrastructure. How is there any thoughts around how here specifically was mentioned municipalities can buy them without being stuck with big losses? Do you have any thoughts on that, considering the market as it is right now?
In terms of conventional infrastructure, to make sure we're clear, I mean, I think one of the investor-owned utilities, if you look at their portfolio and you say, what do we have that's more valuable than anything else? I think it's the customer relationship. Okay, so if you think about it in the context of a customer relationship, what else does that customer need? They need broadband, they need electricity, they need a variety of different things. So you're seeing some of the IOUs looking at ways in which they can sell more to that same customer base. And the thing that they are most at risk of, and I think they fear the most, is losing that customer relationship, because it's the one thing they have now that once they lose, may never be able to get back.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really ties into here, if we want to discuss where are we seeing the most activities by sector. Tom, can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, at least in our universe, I mean, the grid edge is a big deal right now. Okay, so as the growth in DERs continues, we're moving to this DER centric sort of model. And at the grid edge, so there's in front of the meter and behind the meter, and who's going to control that space? And because whoever does has got the ability to participate in transactive energy and generate revenues on a recurring and long-term basis. There's a lot of challenges at the grid edge, okay? And utilities, I think, are waking up to the fact that if they don't control it on the front of the meter side, they're going to become even more disenfranchised than they already are. Then there's a lot of the behind the meter technologies that are being developed. So in our view, and the view that we've seen of late, there's a lot of activity right around the grid edge, and we think that technologies that accelerate the deployment of DERs and the two-way communication technologies and the ability to move electrons both ways and to monitor, manage, and account for those electrons is going to be really important to fulfilling the promise of a DER-centric world, and it's going to affect players in the metering space. It's going to affect players in the wind and solar space. It's going to affect players in the storage space, and it's going to affect the utilities who own that customer relationship and are used to having a one-way business model of selling electrons and collecting for that.
I like, Tom, your emphasis on the potential impact on utilities. One of the early data points that came out of Australia recently, which was, again, Sonnen, owned by Shell, where they're building these housing developments with developers, putting solar on the rooftop, batteries in people's garages or laundry rooms. The customer pays an upfront fee of, say, 13,000 US, about 18,000 Australian, and then $40 a month. And the customer then never sees an electricity bill from their former traditional distribution utility, because Sonnen makes those payments and then integrates everything into virtual power plant and sells services back to the grid. Or we just saw an announcement last month that the microgrid in the port of Rotterdam set up 48 hours future market where 32 buyers in the port integrated around this marketplace, and blockchain tracked 20 million transactions over the course of 2 months, just with those 32 players, lowering overall energy costs by 11% and increasing revenues to the renewables suppliers in that by roughly 20%. So some really interesting models at the grid edge that show how potentially disruptive this could be, and why investors need to be paying attention to what's going on, and those incumbent utilities in particular, to what's going on in some of these postcards from the future.
I think you can also think of it in the broader context of energy as a service. Okay, with IoT, with advanced communications, with advanced data and analytics, there are going to be a number of players who are going to be able to more efficiently generate or acquire generation and supply it to a group of end users who don't really care about anything other than maintaining their costs at the lowest possible thing and ensuring that they have access to power when they need it. So much of the Duke powers of the world, who are basically out there selling everything they can as a service. It very much reminds me of 15, 20 years ago when IBM said, hey, we're going to no longer be a seller of hardware, we're going to be a seller of solutions. And they still use all of their hardware to provide the solutions, but at the end of the day, their customer doesn't care. They only care about getting what they need to run their business. And in that respect, the utilities are in a position to say, okay, here are the various elements that I can bring to the table. Let me manage them on your basis. So I think growth in the sort of managed service provider arena is going to be significant, and there's going to be a number of players fighting to control that relationship and be the service provider of choice.
Right. So as we continue that train of thought here with looking into the future and then the growth of the industry, where it's going to go, we have a question that came in here. Thoughts on this funding that's been, assuming the funding from Biden would go through for clean energy research and development, what do you think would be the impact on the M&A market? How do you see that changing with that kind of an investment?
Well, it takes the risk factors down significantly. So the recognition that there is going to be federal level support in addition to state level support to moving to a cleaner economy frees up people from having the risk reward equation becomes, let's make the investment because we know it's going to be rewarded appropriately. So I think it's a good thing, and one that will cause a lot of the major players to accelerate some of their activities. I mean, we're talking to the meter players, we're talking to the IOUs, we're talking to the big hardware players, SNCs and Schneiders and Siemens in the world, and what they're all sorting through what is it that they have as a core competency, and how do we leverage that into a defensible market share.
I think you've identified the pull. The push is most likely some kind of introduction of carbon pricing into markets, right. Which will, all things being equal, advantage carbon-free or low carbon resources. And then bigger picture, I think you're going to see the hydrocarbon companies disadvantaged, where they're going to make less money because the Biden administration is not going to look favorably upon oil and gas, all things being equal, which if you're one of those companies looking where do you put your next dollar, it's going to be in the sustainable space because you're going to get a better rate of return in many instances.
And they have the balance sheets to do that right now. So they don't have to wait. They don't have to go out and raise capital. They don't have to go. They can, if the incumbents in the electricity industry don't continue to sort of evolve, they're going to have the rug pulled out from under them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that there's going to be evolution that needs to happen here. How do you see that affecting some of these acquisitions? Like, where do these acquisitions, where are they coming in the next few, or where do we expect to see them in the coming years?
Well, I think there's a number of different things. I mean, I think first of all, data is going to be a driver of a lot of things. So there's now new data sets that were never available before that are going to allow you to develop insights into activities in real time that will allow for, actionable insights. So 20 years ago, I was CEO of a company called Pentech Solutions, and our motto was good data properly analyzed leads to trends and correlations that leads to actionable insights. Well, going back to the Coke acquisition of Sentient had developed a advanced technology, sensor technology that gave them a data set that no one else had, and it improved the level of visibility the grid managers had to what was happening on the grid. They're still building out the software to analyze that, but that data matters a lot, okay? I think you're going to see new business models, the DSO model, the energy as a service model, things like that. People are going to start to focus on ways in which they can leverage what they're already good at into a broader market opportunity. I think you're going to see acquisitions both domestically and internationally, because this is an industry that plays on a global level, and there are economies of scale that come with that kind of growth. So those are some of the key areas, I think, but I think data and analytics will be a big part of most everything we see going forward.
Yeah, and looking out, I think hydrogen becomes, just in the last week or two, the valuations of the publicly traded companies have gotten ridiculous compared to what they were just 10 days ago. But it's dawning on a lot of folks that in order for us to decarbonize the power grid, we kind of have a sense where to go with that. We're now getting a sense with transportation that batteries can do a lot of it. Maybe long haul trucking and shipping moves to the hydrogen space. Industry, that probably evolves into the domain of hydrogen. The large oil and gas companies who know heavy steel are either going to acquire people to get into that space or develop those capabilities themselves, because that's going to be one of the next big frontiers in the next decade if we really want to decarbonize global economies.
Speaking of global economy, let's touch on that a little bit. PKD, there's been quite a few acquisitions or M&A activity around Europe coming into America. Can you touch on that and maybe broader in the international market, what you see?
Yeah, I had a chance to chat with some European bankers around why was it that it was the Engies and the Iberdrolas and the companies over in Europe that were making so many of the aggressive moves on the North American chessboard. And the feeling was that their reality around, first they had higher energy prices, so they were more sensitive to a lot of these issues. And then they didn't have the same political divide around carbon. There was a clearer understanding, if you will, of this carbon constrained world. And therefore, and some of their opportunities in Europe became limited. It's a fairly small playing ground. America is a pretty dynamic economy, and it was underdeveloped what was relative to a lot of the opportunities in Europe. So it was a natural fit for them to reach across the pond and start to assemble the pieces on the chessboard here, snapping up the charging companies, some of the battery companies, solar companies, et cetera. It was a logical extension of what many of them had already started doing over there.
Yeah, we think, to your point, Ellen and Peter, virtual power plants are a much bigger play in Europe than they are here. Yet, the amount of consumption that's going on here and the growth in DER suggests that that's just a matter of time before that becomes sort of a core element of the, new electric grid that we're talking about.
The other interesting thing is this whole SPAC thing, where we're seeing ChargePoint move into a SPAC, EOS Energy, the storage company, move into a SPAC, and so on and so forth. And then as soon as they get noticed, the valuations are doubling. I think there's a frothiness in the space right now. You probably would agree with me, Tom, that just
Yeah.
everybody getting so excited about the Biden administration that the valuations have just gone insane over the last couple of weeks, and the SPACs being no exception. I think at some point sobriety will step back in and will recognize that these tools are useful in certain cases and have been way overhyped in other ones.
Agreed. Agreed. But I think microgrids are here. I mean,
Yes.
that's, it's, you're going to be connected to the grid, but you're also going to have the ability to operate independent of the grid. And if everybody has appropriate storage, the issue of brownouts and blackouts and the like is going to be much, significantly reduced. And here in San Diego, where I live, we've got UCSD, which is essentially a backup power generator for SDG&E that runs on its own. It doesn't need to, it has that as a backup, but it also is a generator for SDG&E when it's, facing issues, of supply and demand in the broader market.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There was that famous saying, if you've seen one microgrid, you've seen one microgrid. But now the controllers and the technology is getting better, so it's becoming a bit more of a mix and match. And there's very definitely a trend towards nanogrids too, simplified microgrids with modularity for example, serving police stations, fire stations, schools, et cetera. So I think, Tom, you're right. That sector is really going to grow rapidly.
Well, and the ability now, there's software out there. There's a number of companies we've worked with that, have developed software that allows you to model, simulate and then deploy a microgrid, and then using that same software, optimize it for current market conditions. So everything now can be done almost in real time, and probably information overload for 90% of the population, which is again why you're going to see this managed service provider growth, because there's going to be a few players out there willing to take all that data and organize it. Think of about air traffic controller. It controls all the planes coming in and out of an airport. You wouldn't want each pilot to make that call independent of everybody else. Well, it's going to be the same thing in this space. There are going to be some experts who are going to become unique in their ability to use that technology to control costs, to make power available, as a backup resource, all those kinds of things. And I think that's exciting for folks in the M&A space, because what you've got now is, as people start to figure out what their core competencies are, they're going to shuffle their portfolios, okay? And they're going to sell some divisions and they're going to acquire others. And it's like assembling a basketball team. Hey, this guy no longer fits. We want to play fast, not slow. So we need to get rid of the big 7-foot center and bring in a 6'7", guard. Okay. Every one of the companies that we talk to, particularly the bigger players, are going through that sort of analysis and coming out of it with okay, this is who we want to be in 5 years. How do we, we don't need this asset any longer, but we can't live without this other one.
So do you expect to see any more M&A activities similar to, NextEra's offer to buy Duke for about $60 billion? And maybe you can explain a little bit about that offer and whether or not you see more of those coming.
Peter, you want to take that one?
Oh, the NextEra one I won't comment on, but you do see companies like Iberdrola with its acquisition of PNM. It now has 10 distribution utilities. I think you're going to see some consolidation there, and then certainly those energy holding companies that have those really strong balance sheets continuing to leg into additional acquisition opportunities, just in search of efficiencies and in search of the ability to serve the customer across the spectrum of needs.
I think as some of the product service opportunities become more commoditized, the importance of economies of scale become all the more prevalent. Okay, and so NextEra has the ability to go in and offer new product services, but also leverage some of the relationships and technologies that Duke is already developed and generated. And I don't know. NextEra tends to be very forward-thinking and aggressive. Duke tends to be very thoughtful. So it'll be an interesting match if they do end up combining. But I think that at some point there will be, there's going to be local, regional, national, and global players in the space, and everybody will have to figure out what the footing is that they want to, hold and defend. And then in doing so, they'll figure out what product service offers they can offer and have some price discretion in doing that in order to ensure, a return to their shareholders. Again, remember, one of the core fundamentals here is that people are in this business to make money.
Yeah, and I mean, this is an amazingly interesting time to be in the electric industry. I mean, we've got these three major drivers: the decarbonization, digitization, and decentralization, and they're driving such change, like this influx of foreign investment, consolidation to seek efficiencies that you guys have mentioned. We're seeing all these new business models, new technologies, new markets even, and all of it's gaining momentum, bringing the industry into a new era. So it's an amazing time to be in the industry. Thank you both so much for joining and sharing so much knowledge and information with us today. And thank you to the audience for joining and participating with us as well. Thank you for all the questions. We will follow up with some more information. There's contact information here too, so if you've got any other questions, feel free to reach out. And we hope you have a great week and happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.